We're going, oh yeah, we've got sound. We've got recording here. Just need to make sure, is that happening? Yep, we're recording. Brilliant. So, picking up where we left off with Hobbes and the social contract tradition of statecraft. The dilemma for Hobbes here is in his description of the so-called state of nature. The state of nature, which we see described in chapter 13 of book 1 of the Leviathan, where Hobbes describes human beings in terms of our freedom and equality. Is that in our essence, human beings are free and equal. So then, if that's the case, how can we organize ourselves? How can we organize ourselves if no one is suited by nature to rule? And, you know, further to that, if human beings aren't naturally sociable creatures, if we're primarily in it for ourselves, if we're self-interested, if we're, you know, kind of the first book of the Leviathan really describes a kind of psychology, a political psychology, whereby every individual is basically a pleasure-seeking, risk-averse automaton. You have a question, or okay? Okay, fair enough. If that's what we are, is pleasure-seeking, risk-averse automatons, and if we're not held together in pursuit of a greater good, which had been the classical and the medieval conceptions of the basis of political community, well, how do we then organize ourselves? Especially considering the rather dangerous prospect of living in the company of hostile others, each interested in themselves and uninterested in us. This is the problem. So beginning from a position of freedom and equality, Hobbes tries to build the state back up as what is essentially a machine for the production of social order, a kind of security-producing machine. So this is the dilemma. Now, I mentioned last week that Machiavelli is the first modern, but he kind of straddles between the ancient and the modern traditions, in the sense that he talks about virtue, now radically different than a Christian thinker or a classical thinker would. I'm sorry, Tanya, I figured it out. I just needed to press more buttons, and the proper lights seem to be blinking now, so I think we're okay. Yeah, just introducing Hobbes here. And yeah, differently than Machiavelli, who addresses his work to the prince, a great man, Lorenzo de Medici, not someone he's really fond of, having imprisoned him and tortured him in his dungeons, but still, you know, he's trying to curry his favor. For Machiavelli, it's the great man who holds the state together. For Hobbes, it's the basic psychology of every individual citizen within the state that is the basis of the sovereign state that he describes. And so Hobbes differs from Machiavelli in focusing on structures, on institutions, and on the social contract enforced by power, rather than a single powerful actor as the glue that will hold the state together. And so his account is much more systematic and analytic in describing a rational machine designed to preserve the peace and ensure private security, rather than giving a collection of advice and historical examples to a prince, as Machiavelli does. Hobbes describes the state as a system, as a structure. It's kind of, again, a machine, to use that metaphor. And so chapter 13 of part 1, which is what's on our reading list, of the natural condition of mankind as concerning their felicity and misery. A pleasant chapter title. You may have noticed Hobbes his spelling is kind of curious. Did anyone come across that? Yeah. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Well, and he's writing in a time when the printing press was new. Keep this in mind. This is a really key difference between what we're reading in this book compared to what we're reading in this text. Yeah. So we know how this got to us, eh? These were rolls of papyrus. They were hand copied, like literally handwritten, and then copied from generation to generation to generation. That's a very different medium, if you will, than something coming off a printed press. What's the difference? Yeah.
I think printing press is more blunt towards the offer of meaning, while Thucydides, over generations, people would have changed the meaning, grammatical. The language would evolve slightly as the language evolves.
Yeah, and that's a challenge for a classicist, is to kind of tease apart the interpolations from editors, translators, scribes from the original. That's a real question. Is this the true original, or has someone interjected phrases here or there? That kind of niggly work of classicists, but it's a concern for sure. Is that mode of transmission is not as accurate as something coming off the printing press. And it harkens back to the oral tradition that preceded the written word. For Plato, this was a new thing at the time, the idea that you could write things down. And people looked on it with a great deal of suspicion, actually. Yeah, is your memory that bad that you need to write out your speeches? And being an oral culture as they were, being able to give a convincing speech was a really big deal, or to tell a good story for that matter. A person without a story to tell is hardly a person at all. So that's part of it.
Also within a city like Athens, very direct democracy, which
Yeah.
the ability to communicate with user or person that means that also sends content,
Yeah.
and also be within the limits of this.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a direct democracy at the time. So you speak to all of your fellow citizens and have debates like, should we exterminate the Middle-Earthians? Should we invade Sicily? And everyone has their say. Should we listen to Al-Kabadi? Yeah, a very persuasive speaker. Apparently had a lisp. It is a really unique way of speaking that could have caught people's eyes. Also was fond of purple capes and would release birds when he spoke. Had all these sort of flourishes that went along with it. So yeah, being in public, there was a profound sense of that. Now, reading a book is different. We all know what it's like to read. It's different to read a book by yourself than to be in a public forum where someone's speaking and trying to convince you. What is the difference in terms of your experience of that? How does that feel different? Yeah.
If you're reading more of a passive activity where you're kind of thinking of yourself and you're more critical, I guess, of the way you read, while in speaking, you're still in active act where it's both people are playing off each other, playing off the crowd.
Yeah. You can't kind of bounce back and forth off one another, or the speaker gets a sense of how the crowd is responding, and so that can amplify their message.
Reading passive, it's really valid with in your head how you're
Yeah. Yeah, you get that internal voice, that sense of the interiority of the self. Apparently, St. Augustine was one of the first to read silently, and it really weirded people out that he could read without speaking the words. That's how in Plato, whenever a text, a roll of papyrus is presented, it's as a speaking aid. And you read aloud as you're speaking it. Again, that transition from the oral culture to the written culture. Augustine started reading silently, and people thought, what the heck is he doing? He had driven his voice inside. There's a sense of the individual that comes about as a consequence, I would argue, of the printing press, and the printed word, the transformation of this medium. So Hobbes writes at the outset of the Leviathan, read thyself. Read thyself. And that's a transformation of the Socratic dictum, actually it goes back to the oracle at Delphi, written on this wall of a cave at the oracle at Delphi, was know thyself. Maybe you've seen this or heard this before, know thyself, this dictum. Also along with that, there's another one, don't go too far, Sophra Sune, know thyself, but don't go too far. It was a curious place. There's smoke that came out of the ground, and there were priestesses, sort of young, indigent women, who were lowered over the fumes, and it had some sort of effect on them. It was some kind of drug or something like this, and then they would start speaking in tongues, and people would come and listen to them and try to interpret what they were saying. Anyways, the oracle at Delphi. And written on the wall was know thyself. And that was taken up by Socrates as his kind of claim to fame. That's the point. What is the point of the human endeavor? Is to know thyself. Hobbes says, no, read thyself. Read this book and admit, all of you, that you are fundamentally self-interested, that you are a pleasure-seeking, risk-averse automaton. And on that basis, the first book of the Leviathan, if we all agree that that's how we work, that's what we want, basically, and at the same time that we can't really come into agreement on what is the greater good, that we're fundamentally motivated by self-interest, it becomes quite reasonable then to follow the laws of the state. Yeah. Automaton, like a robot. Yeah. So we're just like a little clockwork mechanism, driven by appetites and aversions, as Hobbes describes it. Now, what you have an appetite for, or what you have an aversion to, that's each to their own. We can't really have a discussion about that, except for violent death. Yeah. In a way, he describes the individual as we have come to know the individual. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, Machiavelli is kind of a liminal character. He's kind of in between the traditions in that he does say that the mass of men simply want to be left alone. We had that discussion about the Republican Rousseauian reading of The Prince last week. The mass of men simply want to be left alone. That's what we would like from our state. Provide security, but don't run your horses over our fields. Don't steal our property. Don't steal our women. That's what we want of the state. So there's some kind of modern sensibility there, but he's talking to a great man. He's talking in terms of virtue. And yeah, for the medievals and for the classics, the community is constitutive. The community, the polis, is not an externality. The community makes us who we are. Now for the moderns, for Hobbes, we begin with our freedom and our equality. We begin with our individuality. And then we ask, well, how are we going to cobble these individuals together to form a cohesive unit if we're not by nature sociable creatures, if we're primarily interested in what's good for ourselves? And so the modern state is put together on that foundation. The basis of the modern state is the free and equal individual. Yeah, please. Yeah. Weber, yeah. Mm-hmm. Monopoly and the legitimate use of organized violence within a territory, yeah.
And that was not just about fear of violence itself, but it's and I'm going to say security of state, but I'm not saying it right. Besides the fear that people live on to, which are the
Yeah. What is the state for? And that's the question here. What is the modern state for? And it is for our security. That's the foundational ask, if you will, that we make of the state in terms of the social contract.
So, but it's not just about fearing the violence or death or the other or whatever. It's also for, it's not just about security, it's, but they won't just use that, they won't just use violence. So, maybe I'm getting mixed up in the
Well,
But what else is it for though, besides that? Is that just,
yeah.
that area, is that all we're talking about, economic growth and modernity, that we talk more about, other than the fear itself, other than just
That's the thing we can agree upon. That's a starting point. Let's, you like certain things, I like different things. We're not going to agree. We're not going to have a rational discussion about what is the good with a capital G. These are values. We're talking about sort of in the context of nature, right? It's subjective, you know, our preferences. So in terms of Hobbes' psychology, he says that, yeah, you have an appetite for this, you have an aversion to that, but we can't base our political community on deliberation on the common good, which had been in the ancient world. But what political community is all about is public deliberation on the common good. Now let's set that aside and say, well, what can we agree on? And he says, well, let's agree that we all fear an untimely violent death. Read thyself and know that we all fear an untimely violent death. Now there are problems with that. Not everyone fears death. Can you think of any examples? Who might not fear death? Yeah?
Well, we, I think, had a conversation about this in classes ago about that nihilistic self-destruction and the unhappy. Yeah.
I think the thing is that everyone cares about preserving something.
Ah,
Even people who are suicidal or suicidal terrorists have some kind of thing in mortality. Their faith, their
Yeah.
reason, their existence, who we
Sure.
are, is where we
yeah,
live on in some sense.
yeah.
Terrorists kill themselves because they have always been something else in the world, their religion.
And that's what's so dangerous about them, is that they are, whether it's an individual or kind of a suicidal actor, like the Islamic State, for example, how do you adjust the behaviors of that actor? You know, if you've got this wild fantasy that you're going to ascend into the afterlife and live in paradise, bring about the end times through this confrontation between Islam and the West, how do you manage that kind of actor? This is a question for Walter Lacour. Your question.
The reason that he answers back, the only thing he says in the subject is if there are certain immortality projects that are undesirable, the society itself has to deny and eradicate it.
And so what Hobbes does, his treatment of that problem is that they're crazy, that's irrational behavior, first and foremost. So he decries the martyrs and the vainglorious, as he describes them. You know? People who are willing to martyr themselves for a higher cause, or the vainglorious, people who think they're just all that in a bag of chips, you know, and willing to put themselves on the line just for the sake of their honor, even if that means perhaps dying, dying a hero's death. Martyrs and the vainglorious. And Hobbes' response is kind of simple, actually. He says, fear death or die. And that's the sovereign power that the state retains. The state retains the power to kill. And so, in terms of the social contract, the state remains a third party to the contract. The state stays in the state of nature and retains the perfect freedom that we all presumably would have in the state of nature, so as to back up the social contract. So we all agree amongst ourselves, I won't steal your stuff, I won't kill you, and I hope you do the same. And the guarantor of that is the state. And that's the means by which we manage this condition of our inherent freedom and equality given to us by nature. Okay. Let's take a look at the text here. This is the opening lines of chapter 13. And this is one of the reasons why I like giving you actual books as opposed to these online readings or the Blackboard readings. I understand it's cheaper, but it is handy at the point to have the book. Oh, by the by, I went by the bookshop, and they were full of apologetics, but apparently there's an e-book version of Thucydides of our translation that they can connect you with there. Anyways, he starts off chapter 13 saying, nature hath made men so equal. Nature made human beings equal in the faculties of body and mind, as that though there be found one man, spells B-E-E, no dictionaries yet. So he's just making it up in terms of the spelling as he goes along. There be found one man, sometimes manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable, is that one man can thereupon claim to himself any benefit to which another may not pretend, as well as he. For as to the strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger with himself. So that's where we begin. We begin with equality. We begin with this perfect freedom to kill another. It's curious. I like to think of myself as a relatively free spirit, but when I get out of bed in the morning, my first thought isn't, let's go killing. That's not the first order of business. But for Hobbes, the fact that we're self-interested, that what is of interest to another may impede upon our interests, inclines in that direction. From equality and freedom leads, as he describes it, diffidence and conflict between human beings. But we start with freedom and equality. This is the beginning point. It's also the problem that he introduces. So, if we're all essentially equal, no one is by nature suited to rule over anyone else. There are no natural rulers. He's a modern in that sense. It's against great man politics. There's a point of distinction between Hobbes and Machiavelli. We begin with the self-interested, atomistic, calculating individual. Has anyone taken economics courses? Yeah? You've heard of Homo economicus? This idea that the individual is primarily trying to maximize their pleasures with the scarce resources that they're provided with.
Yeah, I was wondering
Yeah, the economics of the firm. Yeah. That's our basic motivation. It's an idea that Hobbes would have been really familiar with. And so then the question again is, well, how do we get along? Our absolute equality, coupled with the complete freedom that we enjoy by nature, leads to, as Hobbes describes it, war of all against all. There is a constant disposition to war, to conflict. Peace is not the end of politics, but describes basically intervals between battles. And so an artificial social order needs to be imposed upon human beings to relieve them from their state of nature. To get out of the state of nature and enjoy the protections offered by the social contract. Let's take a look at the text here, 185. I'll say too that in international relations, this passage, this chapter is what you'll often see in readers in terms of the application of Hobbes to international relations. But I think it's helpful to read the whole thing at a point, and when we engage in great political questions too, we'll do this in a more fulsome way. But in IR, when they're talking about Hobbes, this is what they're talking about right here. So here's the description of our state of nature. He says, again, Men have no pleasure, but on the contrary, a great deal of grief in keeping company, where there is no power able to overawe them all. So if there isn't a power that can enforce the social contract, the company of our fellow human beings gives us a great deal of grief. We're not naturally sociable creatures. For every man looketh that his companions should value him at the same rate he sets upon himself. What is it that human beings want according to that? Sure, yeah. For every man looketh that his companion should value him at the same rate he sets upon himself. People say, look at me, I'm great. You should recognize me as being great. And human beings are not naturally inclined to do that. Human beings are driven by recognition. And upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing, naturally endeavors, as far as he dares, which amongst them that have no common power to keep them in quiet is far enough to make them destroy each other, to extort a greater value from his contemptors by domage, and from others by the example. So that in the nature of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel. First, competition. Secondly, diffidence. Third, glory. The first maketh men invade for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation. Glory. Glory. Yeah. Competition, I want more for myself. Diffidence, I'm afraid of you. Glory, recognize me. Now, these are the sources of conflict. So conflict is basically hardwired into the way human beings behave, is the point that Hobbes is trying to make here. And recall that he's writing this in a book and asking us all to read ourselves, again, so that we consent to the social contract and recognize the sovereignty of the state. Yeah.
One follow-up, he says, so any things are individual, they're all driven by certain self-interest.
Yeah.
But he never states that that's self-interest that incurs self-rest, where certain, since humans are all different, some humans will have different natures. Some people might be naturally inclined to help instead of murder. Some people might actually hold virtues and community, others won't.
Maybe.
He never really answers that question.
I don't think it matters. I think that's how we want it. This is how we live, not just that.
It doesn't matter, because it presupposes the fact that human nature can change, because it's sporadic.
And he says that it doesn't. This nature that he's describing, this human nature, the state of nature.
Just making this point clear that it has nothing to do with any greater good or what people are like or any human being so much. But it's like, I think he's the part of it. And he describes the way human beings, I think are the possible behaving or the psychology that
Mhm.
he's clearly saying, doing what kind of social contract and you need to define that social contract.
Yeah.
They're not really pointing it toward anything else, but it's just their companion.
Yeah, and it could be that, someone would be inclined to acts of beneficence, but you can't trust that. You can't base a state on that sort of subjective value of this individual or that individual. Maybe, but fundamentally we're self-interested. We desire our continued self-preservation. We like having more stuff. We appreciate our security. That's the lever on our psychology that's moved by the state, which again retains that power of life and death over us, so as to enforce social contracts, so as to enforce the laws. But the point Hobbes is making here is just that we're naturally inclined to conflict. Outside of the protections offered by the state, we're naturally inclined to conflict. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man. A war of all against all. This is what the state of nature looks like according to Hobbes, in the absence of the sovereign authority of the state. And so the aim here clearly is to get ourselves out of the state of nature and rationally consent to the social contract, which is basically a protection scheme. That's the point of the modern state. This is interesting for the purposes of international relations, especially. It goes on to define what is war. For war, W-A-R-R-E, again, making up spelling as he goes. And there's really no rhyme or reason to the capitalization or the all caps that Hobbes uses. Sometimes it's just really important to him, so all caps it goes. But it's just that. It's just his personal sort of flourish and emphasis. For war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting. And fast forwarding to Grotius and Vattel, that's how they define war in terms of, or Clausewitz for that matter. War is political intercourse continued by other means. Yeah? War is the battle for that political objective, that interest, which then limits the war. Not so for Hobbes. There's war, this war of all against all, whenever we're in the state of nature, even if we're not actually fighting. So you could be sort of bumping around your corner of the wilderness, and I could be bumping around mine, and then, if we don't bump into each other, we may not be fighting, but there's a constant disposition to the moment that we do meet. This is our natural inclination. For war consisteth not in a battle only or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. So if there's the idea that we could be fighting, we're at war. And this is why, in terms of international relations, some thinkers like Kenneth Waltz, for example, describe the state system as anarchical. If there is no global sovereign or Leviathan, state that can enforce international law, states, in terms of their relations with one another, are in an anarchical condition. There's a constant possibility of war, even if they're not actually fighting at that particular moment. And he compares it to weather. And therefore, the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is in the nature of weather. Machiavelli speaks in similar terms. For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there is no assurance of the contrary. All other time is peace. So peace then requires that assurance. We can only enjoy a modicum of peace within the provisions and protections offered by the state. Outside of the state, thrown back into the state of nature, whether it's in a lawless regime, failed state, for example, or again in terms of the relations between states, war remains a perennial possibility. Just carrying on, this is probably the most famous passage from the Leviathan here. Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. So thrown back on our own resources, we're in this state of nature, we're in this state of war. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain. What does Hobbes mean by that? There's no place for industry in the state of nature. Why would that be the case? Yeah? Yeah, so you wouldn't engage in industrious activity because someone will come and steal it from you. Huh? You have no security of your possessions. And so people just wouldn't do very much if the argument he's making here. And consequently, no culture of the earth. no culture of the earth. So why grow a garden if someone could come along and steal your tomatoes from the vine, yeah, at any particular moment?
Doesn't Hobbes undermine his own point by stating that, though?
How do you mean?
By stating that humanity can build infrastructure, gardens, et cetera, because the piece is admitting that human nature can change within a certain scenario and have some peace.
No, again, for Hobbes, unlike the late moderns after Rousseau, human nature is unchanging. And so this remains a constant concern. The moment we're thrown back into the state of nature, the moment the state stops functioning, this is where we end up. You know, you go in a dark alley, you go into the wilds of Afghanistan, outside of Kabul, you are back in the state of nature. And all of these concerns come to bear. Why be industrious? Why grow a garden? And it carries on here. It says, no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea. Why would you not have navigation or importing and exporting of goods under these circumstances?
Well, then I had a navigation for you guys, like and stuff to do that we work really
Someone else, or for that matter, sailors are not the most trustworthy characters all the time. You know, they get on the ship, you say, go over there, bring this over there, bring something else back, and then all of a sudden they're pirates. They're taken off. Yeah? So there isn't that basis of trust that would allow for coordinated human activity, is what Hobbes is saying here. And so we have all these sort of knock-on effects, like, and we have a picture too of what a state can accomplish. You know, provided for this security, now we have industry, now we have agriculture, now we have navigation and trade. No instruments in moving and removing such things as require much force. No knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. So he builds up what human beings can accomplish on the basis of the security provided by the state, including science here, you know, and arts and letters. Things that require, again, a modicum of security in order to just get along with our fellow human beings, to coordinate our actions in this way. And here's the most famous line. This is a good one to commit to memory. You know, if there were an exam, I would entice you with the prospect of this being on the exam, but now maybe just for the sake of knowing a famous line from a famous book. And what is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. That's the message that Hobbes is trying to drive home to us, the readers. Read thyself. Recognize that outside of the protections offered by the state, this is our underlying reality. So again, follow the laws. Even if the state is not particularly just, follow the laws. It's better than the anarchy that awaits us otherwise. And here's the line. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Probably the most quoted line from Hobbes' Leviathan. Let's go through that in order. Solitary. Why would life in the state of nature be solitary? Interestingly, you know, if you think about trust at the most basic level, for most of us, it would be within the family unit, within the household. There's no family here either for Hobbes. Kind of random couplings, and then children are dropped in the dirt. I don't quite know how that works itself out. This is kind of imagined. We got to think. But yeah, we would have a solitary existence. Is the point that he's making here? Solitary, poor. Why poor? Yeah. Just hand them out, day to day. Yeah. No accumulation of commodious articles of consumption or homes even for that matter. Solitary, poor, nasty, continually fearful of our own untimely end. Brutish, without all of the sort of science, arts, culture that are built up on this basis. In short, we are all going to die in an untimely fashion, is the argument being made here. So if we agree with that, then again, the social contract makes rational sense. And in terms of international relations, then also, we have this sort of foreboding apprehension that war is a perennial possibility, and indeed the sort of defining feature of the state. Once again, because the state stays in the state of nature. The state retains that power of violent death. We give that up. I'll give that up. I won't kill you. You don't kill me. But the state has to be able to do that in order to keep us all in an agreement in terms of this, in terms of the social contract. That said, the laws themselves are largely arbitrary in their content. It doesn't really matter. There are no just and unjust regimes. There are only regimes more or less capable of producing security. That is the foundational function of the state, what we expect of it in terms of a social contract. Other nice things can come along after that, but that's the basis of it.
There's no just or unjust regimes, but there's what?
There are simply regimes that are more or less capable of producing social order.
Oh,
Yeah. There's no idea of justice that overarches the state. Justice itself is a human construct.
Hobbes wrote this during the English Civil War, correct?
Yeah. With the Spanish Armada at the shore. Yeah.
Is it wrong to read this in as a reaction of Hobbes' experience within the Civil War? That's why he's so apt to defend tyrannical states is because he is stuck within an exception where law and justice is suspended?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and I would just offer a kind of cautionary note here in terms of how we read the canon, how we read these canonical texts. And I would caution you against reading a thinker out of their particular moment in time. These books endure. We've got texts here that are 2,500 years old. And what that says to me, at least to the extent that I think there's meaning in that you can learn from, is that these thinkers transcend their time and their place. Yeah.
Well, there's no reason why Hobbes spends time. Well, Hobbes' literature is written in a state of emergency.
Yeah.
The reason why his literature is so relevant is because whenever humanity reaches a state of exception,
Hmm.
repeats problems and powerful over and over and over again. It
Hmm.
only applies within that state of exception.
Hmm.
And that way it is timeless as though we're always in state of exception, but it's also not universal as in there are periods, like say the Rousseau's period or like a clock.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. That definitely the sort of experiences of the author may inform how they think and what they wrote. True, but I wouldn't reduce a thinker to those circumstances. Again, and I think that's implicit in what you're describing there, that there are certain resonances, that something that's meaningful at one time can be meaningful at another time as well. But the danger, I think, as students of this tradition, that our danger is that we don't want to think that we're wiser than these thinkers are. That you could say, like, I know why you think what you're thinking better than you know why you're making this particular case. And that's the challenge of exegesis, is to read out of the text rather than reading into the text. So for example, you could make the case that Aristotle justifies slavery because he's living in a slave-owning society. That said, his teacher, Plato, argued that women should have an equal part in rule. That some women are stronger than some men. Some women may have the sort of nature of warriors and be suited to serve in the guardian class. Crazy idea at the time, like a deeply patriarchal society. From the Peloponnesian War, we know that the women were basically only allowed out to cry at funerals in terms of their public life. So for Plato to say that, no, women can rule and should be warriors as well, says to me that people can transcend their historical and social circumstances and speak beyond their moment in time.
Even Hobbes, like saying, when translating beyond his time, he was still writing about that state of exception and how he was state to happen. When the state is already there. I don't think Hobbes has a real critique of what happens when the state moves beyond the need of a Leviathan. He doesn't have a critique of, well, they came later, like historic time.
They come after Hobbes, yeah.
He doesn't really state what happens when the state of exception ends. And I think he's stuck always writing about an exception.
Well, and, so I can tell you're drawing on Schmidt here from Professor Texer, perhaps. And yeah, Schmidt was a great admirer of Hobbes. And, they, I think, both agree that, again, when the street lights go out, that's what we're thrown back into. So that we can enjoy the security that we do now, and we cooperate, and we're peaceful with one another, and we have economic development and all the rest. But yeah, when the lights go out, that's where we're thrown back to, is the state of nature. And it's that apprehension, that fear, that causes us to follow the laws. That's why we follow the laws, because we're, fearful of the consequences of breaking them, punishment. And, we'd like to be able to get away with it ourselves if we could, but have deep apprehensions about others being able to break the laws, and violate our, the integrity of our person or our stuff, for that matter. That's why. Not because of an idea of justice, not because of an idea of virtue, not because of natural sociability that we have, or an inclination to want to engage in debates on the common good. No. Self-interest is the motivator for human beings, and the basis for our following the laws, and the basis then too of the modern state. So, and within this, there is no overarching conception of justice. On page 188, he writes, "To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. There is no idea of justice or injustice in the state of nature. Perfect freedom. Freedom to do whatever you want. Again, kill, steal, whatever. None of that is inherently unjust. It's only unjust to the extent that the state says it is and can enforce those laws." The argument here is similar to Machiavellian's, where there are good arms, there are bound to be good laws. Therefore, I shall set aside the topic of good laws and talk about good arms. In the classics, the question is, well, what is the idea of justice? Here, justice is a law that you can enforce. And in the absence of that capacity to enforce a law, there is no inherent idea of justice itself. There is no natural law for Hobbes, as there is, say, for Grotius and Vattel, later thinkers of the just war theory tradition. "The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice." Okay? This is the idea. Again, justice is something that we make, primarily in order to provide for our own self-interestedness and our own security. But beyond that, there is no higher law. This means, too, it's very important in terms of interstate relations. It means that in terms of relations between states, there is no law that overarches them, because there is no power that could enforce the law, presumably. So this is what the state of nature looks like. And this is, again, why we need to get out of there as quickly as we can. And so, at this point in the argument, Hobbes starts looking around for examples. Says, well, can we see instances where this is the case? And this is one of the more notorious episodes in the history of Western political thought, shared in by other state of nature thinkers like Rousseau and like Kant, in that we're talking about a time when first contact with the New World was a really big deal for European thinkers. And so this is presented as one potential example. Yep.
I'm sorry to go back on a little bit when you were talking about interstate relations,
Yeah.
and law of relations, sort of between across and Portugal. What would you say is Hobbes' opinion on God's power?
He agrees, and actually Morgenthau relies on Hobbes for part of his argument. Not in this particular reading, but earlier on in the text, he says that human beings desire power after power that ceaseth only in death. Excuse me. So in terms of what do we all want? We all want power, because power is fungible. Power can be translated into any number of things, the power to do this, the power to do that. And there's no limit to it. Power is not a means to an end. Power is the end in and of itself. That applies both to individuals and then also to states then too. Now, again, just to contrast with the classical tradition, thinkers like Plato and Aristotle say that power is important for politics, but it is a means to an end. So you provide security, you provide well-being to your people, and then the question is, well, what's worth doing with our freedom? What's worth doing with our leisure? That's the end in and of itself. Here, there's this kind of endless acquisitiveness, endless possessiveness that characterizes, according to Hobbes, the human condition, the human nature. Yeah.
Power is the end in itself, and why do you see so often when you get power, you need for idealistic ends? Even in the age of overpower in colonialism, you saw England and France investing in Africa, which gave them no real power gain. They did it for ideology. Germany has not any power from Africa.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll treat that question in more depth and detail when we turn to imperialism. But I would harken back to the Athenian thesis. Do you remember the Athenian thesis? This argument made by Athenian ambassadors to the Spartans as to why they have this empire and why they want to hold on to it, why they want to continually expand it. They said there are three motives: fear, honor, and interest. Fear that if they slacken in their exertion of control over their empire, that subject cities will revolt. Honor, I think this speaks to the point here, that it feels sweet to live at the center of the world, or feel as if you do. The honors that were attributed to Athens as the school of Hellas, as Pericles calls it, were significant. And then interests. Athens had all of the wealth of the Mediterranean funneled into its port. Those are three good reasons why. Beyond just strictly national interests, there are these reputational measures. You use the language of ideology. That's kind of anachronistic to the time. Ideology really begins with the French Revolution. The idea that there's a logos of ideas, a science of ideas, is unique to that historical period. But I think we can get it in terms of just reputation, recognition. That figures into why empires expand. To your point.
You really know that ideology begins with the French Revolution.
Yeah.
What thinker said that? Or where can I find it?
Destutt de Tracy is the first to use the word, and I won't try to pronounce it in French because my pronunciation is poor, but the last name is T-R-A-C-Y, Destutt de Tracy. I can't remember the name of the book, but he's the first to coin that idea. It's a neologism at the time, and again, to put together idea and logos, like a science of ideas, that there is one true idea, is rather unique to the modern period. Actually, we have a whole course on that, modern ideologies. So if you're interested, I'd say I'd point you in that direction. Yeah. So at this point in the text for Hobbes, he starts just sort of fetching about for examples of what this state of nature could actually look like. Say, beyond these hypotheticals, where can we look for and find a state of nature? It may peradventure be thought there was never such a time, nor a condition of war as this. And I believe it was never generally so over all the world. So it's not as if there's a kind of a world history that moved us from the state of nature to the present set of circumstances. But he goes fishing about anyways in a rather ignorant and racist fashion, I would say. He says, for the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord whereof dependeth on natural lust, have no government at all. Now that's just pure ignorance, because there were political organizations in the New World, as it was described. But even on that point, he says that, well, maybe there were families here, but according to his description of the state of nature, even that sort of measure of social organization doesn't have a place. It's unique, actually. Hobbes, unlike Rousseau, says that men don't have any position of privilege in relation to women within the context of the family. So not only is no one suited by nature to rule over others, but men aren't suited by nature to rule over women either, within a kind of patriarchal idea of the family. But this is really a head scratcher to me, and it's just pretty clear in this particular instance that this is not true. This is ignorant, but he's, again, fishing about for examples. The example, in my view, doesn't fit the state of nature he's describing, again, to the extent that there's any kind of social organization, even just at the level of the family. That's not a state of nature, according to how he describes it. Have no government at all and live at this day in that brutish manner, as I said before. Yeah, that's entirely untrue. Howsoever it may be perceived, what manner of life there would be, where there was no common power to fear, by the manner of life which men had formerly lived under a peaceful government, used to degenerate into a civil war. That would imply that the New World was just a war of all against all prior to contact, that there's no mode of political organization whatsoever. So he floats that example. It's not a particularly good one. This is the example, though, and this is the passage that's often pointed to in international relations as an indication of the anarchical quality of the interstate system. It says, but though there had never been any time wherein particular men were in a condition of war one against another, he kind of brackets what he had just said there and said, well, maybe human beings have never lived really, properly speaking, in a state of nature. Yet in all times, kings and persons of sovereign authority, because of their independency, are in continual jealousies and in the state and posture of gladiators, having their weapons pointed and their eyes fixed on one another, that is, their forts, garrisons, and guns upon the frontiers of their kingdoms, and continual spies upon their neighbors, which is a posture of war. So this is the example that he uses of a state of nature, that is, the relations between states, in the absence of a sovereign authority overarching them all. What do we make of that? What do we make of that argument? Do states exist in a state of nature in relation to one another? Is that a good example? Yeah.
I know you're warning putting these right under contemplate, but what you said about ideology that exists when we fall in the era, before that there was no set of ideas for government states, therefore, at least before the end of the armed wars, there was no law. There was
Okay. Yeah.
Well, the Hobbes says that states are allowed to be in state of nature. Like, the sort of contract that we're supposed to be trying to enforce that all states have that. So if they have that ability, like the sovereign standing on the sovereign, and what the state standing on the state, then they have every right to have that conflict, I guess, because they're essentially probably trying to be, from what I understand, they're trying to probably have conflict of interest of some sort, and then that's allowed.
Well, it's allowed because there are no rules that would prohibit it. And
There's no global, like, there's no idea, or there's no UN or anything, like,
Yeah.
there's nothing even today, so there's nothing that would put sovereign nations outside of state.
yeah. What is the international community to do when the United States decides to engage in an illegal and unjust war in Iraq? Huh? What, you know, we have readings and giving you the YouTube link of Secretary of State Colin Powell's presentation of the UN Security Council asking for that stamp of legality to be applied to the invasion of Iraq. Didn't get it. Huh? Didn't convince that body that Iraq either had weapons of mass destruction or had designs upon acquiring them. And even in the absence of a UN Security Council mandate, which is one of the two grounds for the legality of war, the other is self-defense. States under the UN Charter can use armed force if they have been attacked, if an attack has occurred, or the UN Security Council can mandate use of force if the behavior of a state threatens international peace and security. There are two bases for there being a legal war. Neither of those applied in the case of the United States invading Iraq. And what are you going to do about it? Huh? What's the international community going to do about it? What could occur? There's a lot of hand-wringing. The Europeans were very upset. The Russians and the Chinese thought, well, hey, you can do it, I can do it too. And I would say that the annexation of parts of Georgia by the Russian Federation, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that door was open to those kinds of events, or the annexation of Crimea, for example, illegal. But once that door is opened by a hegemon, by a powerful state, other powerful states say, well, all bets are off then. Although if we trust Grotius on this, Grotius says that all things are uncertain. The moment human beings depart from law, what can we trust then? If it is just the sort of law of the jungle applying here, how can states come into trusting relations with others? Hobbes says, well, they really can't. They're constantly in this posture of gladiators, pointing their weapons at one another, even if they're not engaged in outright hostilities at any one particular moment. What do we make of this argument? Is that true? Do states exist in a state of nature vis-a-vis one another? Any counter-arguments to that claim made by Hobbes here? Is that a good example of a state of nature? Do you think it is?
I think it's true.
Okay. Okay.
And I don't think it matters what side of it is long.
So let's think about our closest neighbor, Canada and the United States. There are frictions for sure. What is the big complaint now? Canadians with RVs can't drive across the border, go down into Florida. So there are concerns there. But are we worried that the United States could launch an armed invasion of Canada? Is that a serious concern? No. We've got an American politics aficionado here. Why is that not a real concern?
Well, they made a great movie about that, but
Which one is this?
Canadian Bacon.
Oh, I haven't seen this one. That's a John Candy movie, eh?
Yeah.
I have not
It's
seen it.
about Americans invading Canada.
Oh, okay.
The other way around. Canada invading America. Something like that.
Did they come for our bacon, or
I don't know. It was a great movie though.
was it? Was
watched
it?
it a while ago, but
Okay, noted.
yeah. I don't think it's a real concern though, just because of
not just that, but also the closest that we have in the similarities of culture, right?
Hmm.
We're very similar in most respects.
Hmm.
Um,
We watch the same movies.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, there's kind of cultural affinities. Yeah, jump in.
Like, I don't know, certain revolutions, we've had conflict where it has been real, where the in the north and the south didn't always get along, and there was situations of conflict like that have been. So, and we can't say that we'll never get into a split with the south. It can happen.
It has happened. Actually,
And maybe not. I'm not even saying that maybe not to the extent, but it can happen.
yeah.
Who knows, right?
So,
Never, because two federations, two federal democracies on federal two, the people themselves would never, ever, ever vote Norway for war with Canada.
okay, so there are limitations from within then, from within a Republican regime at least. The people would say, well, what is the point of this conflict? Although, you know, in the case of Hobbes, back to this text, there is that sense of self-limitation from within. You know, if we follow the laws, if we recognize the sovereignty of the state because it protects our, you know, the integrity of our person, citizens would not be inclined to go to war for purposes other than strict self-defense. So there's, you know, the sovereign is lawless, exists in a state of nature, is not constrained by any higher law. It is constrained by this basis of its support in the civilian population. You know, rulers recognize that they don't have a divine right to rule. They're not suited based upon their lineage or, you know, their godliness or their virtue to rule. They rule simply because people enjoy the security of the person. So that kind of checks what states could accomplish vis-a-vis their relations with one another. Yeah, I wonder about this though. Like, again, in terms of Canada-U.S. relations, there's a kind of an understanding that we have. There's a shared liberal ideology, you could say. We're both, you know, small L liberal regimes that see human beings as inherently free and equal. See, you know, the legitimacy of the government as being conferred by the consent of the government to their government. See the value, perhaps, in a free market economy with some sort of government intervention at critical moments, like what we've just gone through. Yeah.
No rational reason to go to war, as both nations see the universal value of humanity as an individual.
Well, we're talking about Canada and the United States. I mean, if you were talking about it as a continent,
So let's say,
Okay.
let's say Germany and Canada, both, as long as both nations agree of the universal value of the individual, they'll never go to war with each other because we're talking far too great for individual interests.
That's Kahn's point. That's Kahn's point. And, you know, that's Woodrow Wilson's point from this 13 points address. Progress is possible in politics.
Even doesn't mean war. Athens only ever really engaged in offensive war, like Sicily, when populist leaders started taking advantage.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Very good.
I just wanted to listen to this, that's way more irrational.
Yeah,
Populism.
and sometimes states take decisions on an irrational basis. There's that. But I just wonder, at a really basic level, the fact that states seem to engage in mutually productive, kind of fruitful relations with one another, like trade, for example, seems to belie Hobbes' point here. Yeah.
okay. So say we had like a place that was a place of
Ah, yeah.
in North America, and say we went to a state of laws, as they say that time.
Yeah.
I would argue that it's possible that there could be any type of war at any point in time, no matter what anything is.
Okay. So we just enjoy good circumstances, and so the weather's good now, but the foul weather could be coming. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. That's a dark picture that we're painting here. Yeah.
Let's just say Flag Plane 2.0 shows up. There's destiny in everything.
Yeah.
What point when we make
So yeah, it may be that the security that we enjoy is like a little island in the sea of change surrounding, and that the nature of foul weather lieth not in the storm or two, but the inclination there too, as Hobbes says. It's possible that that could be coming. But I wonder, there seem to be two real differences here between the state of nature that exists between individuals within the state and relations between states. One significant difference is that individuals within the state, recall back to the opening lines of chapter 13, were equal. Even the weakest could conspire to kill the strongest in their sleep or something like this, yeah? So human beings are equal. We know that states are not. Some states are much more powerful than others. Liechtenstein and the United States are on two different levels in terms of the kind of power they can exert.
I think it's got a chance we believe hard enough that he's trying to beat America.
Could beat America. Okay, that's far-fetched, but
Liechtenstein is the only army to ever go to war and gain peace. And they can do this better.
okay. Yeah, well, that's a bold statement.
See, that's what they did the last time. When they go to war, they just talk to the other side and recruit them to their side. That's what they did the last time, and they got negative casualties.
Interesting. So there's different ways of exerting power, perhaps, yeah? Hard and soft power. Do it or else, or do it because it's the right thing to do. But the point I'm making is a real simple one, is that we don't begin with a condition of equality in terms of interstate relations. There are these asymmetries, yeah? And so powerful states have more of a say when it comes to the structure of the interstate system. The P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, have an outsized say in terms of what world order looks like, because each of them has a veto on the Security Council that can mandate use of force against aberrant regimes. So there's that. And, there's this other challenging fact that states do engage in peaceful relations with one another all the time. There's kind of agreement in terms of our cultural assumptions. What Joseph Nye calls kind of complex interdependence, that when you, just by doing business with others, you come to enjoy the same underlying assumptions. It's called the Davos culture. World leaders meet every year in Davos, chat about what their priorities are for the year upcoming. Just by getting together and meeting, their interests are aligned through that act of sociability. Going to a conference together, shaking hands, making old acquaintances, and new ones as well. So, and again, that belies Hobbes' point that human beings are fundamentally antisocial, basically, and given the chance, would turn on one another if it suited their interests in that particular moment. All right, I'm looking at the clock. We should have a little break at this point. Let's take a pause here, and then we will reconvene 15 minutes or so, something like that. I'm going to press pause on this. Did I do that? I think I did. All right. And we are recording. All right. So, unless there are any questions about Hobbes, we spent a fair bit of time there, but he's a foundational thinker, both within political theory and within international relations, for reasons that we discussed in terms of that idea of the sovereign state and what is it. But I'd like to turn, actually that was from our readings last week, which is fine. We'll make our way through, and the fact that we won't have a sit-down exam gives us a little more flexibility in terms of what we can do here together. Normally I would be making sure that I kind of pepper this discussion with some acronyms or some identification phrases that you'd be tested on in your exam. Your take-home exam will be just essays, so you can be a little more selective about your learning in the course, in terms of what you focus on. So I'm fine with that. If we don't get to all the material at the end, that's fine and dandy. I'm not too fussed. I'd like to turn to the topic of just war theory. And this in many ways kind of belies that claim made by Hobbes that states exist in an anarchical state of affairs in terms of their relations, where war is always possible. Just war theory tries to describe the justifications for war, what would make a war just in terms of its beginnings, its causes, and jus ad bellum in the Latin, a just cause for war. And just war theory also describes what can be considered just conduct during an armed conflict, jus in bellum. I'd like to focus here on jus ad bellum, the just causes of war, and draw from Hugo Grotius and Améric de Vattel, who both ask, is war ever justified, and if so, under what conditions? Now, we're really going back to the origins of international law here. You want to understand, where does international law come from? Well, we often point to the Charter of the United Nations as the most significant source of international law. But in terms of the theoretical apparatus, we're casting back here to Grotius and Vattel. And I think one thing that I'd underline for you initially is that here we're kind of going back behind the moderns, behind Machiavelli and Hobbes, so as to argue that there is an overarching sense of justice. There is something akin to natural law. And as soon as you talk about natural law, we're kind of invoking a set of assumptions that are not shared in by moderns like Machiavelli and Hobbes. We know this quite clearly from that description given by Hobbes, where he says there is no law in our natural state. It's completely lawless. Nothing is inherently good or evil or just or unjust. Human beings are essentially free. Vattel and Grotius say there is some law that's based in nature itself. And so they resort, in terms of their sources, they resort to medieval thinkers. They resort to the Bible, New and Old Testament, and they cast back, especially for Grotius, to Aristotle as a description of what we might mean by a natural law that should constrain the behaviors of states. Again, both in terms of what would justify armed conflict and what is just conduct during an armed conflict. And so, we've talked a little bit about idealism and realism. Both of these thinkers, can somebody shut the door there, please? Hey, thanks. These two thinkers kind of straddle those divisions in the sense that neither Grotius nor Vattel believes or would agree with Machiavelli in that idea that might makes right, that the only basis of law is the power to enforce it. I shall set aside the topic of good laws and just talk about good arms. They don't agree with that, nor do they agree with the kind of Christian pacifist take on international relations, the sort of turn the other cheek, principled pacifism that is associated with that particular religious tradition and others. They argue that war may be of perennial necessity under certain limited circumstances. And so the effort here is to limit war within the dictates of reason. What is a reasonable cause to enter into armed conflict? That's the question they ask. What justifies a war? And so Grotius, because he's drawing on this earlier tradition, he does not agree with Hobbes either when Hobbes says that human beings are essentially free, or that states are free vis-a-vis one another. He, again, sides more with the ancients here in saying that states, like individuals, are constituted by their relations to other states. And those relations can improve over time. Trust can be built. Alliances can be forged. Trading partners can be acquired and interdependency established. A sense of understanding of one another can be established on the basis of ongoing negotiations and relations. Those relations are real in that sense. And along with those relations between states go duties and responsibilities, emergent norms and customs. It's interesting. Are people following the fallout of the case of the two Michaels and their return, with both the United States and Canada claiming that there was no quid pro quo, that there was no exchange, there was no hostage diplomacy that occurred there? Why would they continue to say that, even though it is pretty clear that there was, given the timing of that event?
I only, when I read that, eyewitness concept, saving face almost.
Yeah.
Like neither the quid pro quo argument probably came with the fact that he was saying like, hey, let's just say that we both simultaneously get independent of each other, that is the system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's the saving face dimension for both sides here. You know, yeah, China is not the baddie here. We did not cave into that hostage diplomacy. Yeah.
Well, the same what they say at face value. I forget whatever name was extradited on treaty-based reasons, Canada's obligation.
Yeah.
We did not engage in that diplomacy, but what happened is we put China in a situation where they had to do it at that point, or else they would like completely deny it. So they're trying to say like, we didn't engage it, they just did that on their own terms, they had to.
Mm.
It was terrible as Canada extradited her, and we kept finding.
And, you know, at the level of diplomacy, we're talking about actual individuals who have relations with one another. There's that face-to-face dimension of diplomacy. And you need to be able to carry on those relations. And it would be hard to do that if China were called out for taking Canadian citizens hostage, or, you know, if Canada were shown to be weak vis-a-vis the Chinese. So the saving face dimension is important. But I think even more important is this norm. That's not normal for a state to effectively weaponize its judicial system by taking foreign nationals hostage. Those norms are important. Now you could say, well, what's a norm? Sure, it's not normal to do that, but you know, there's a kind of a will to power moment where we say, yeah, we'll do it in spite of the fact that this is widely recognized to be just an atrocious pattern of behavior. Those norms have meaning. You're going to have to carry on doing business with one another. And some bare minimum level of trust and mutual expectation is required to carry on doing business, even if you're not particularly friendly with one another. Diplomacy only really matters when it comes to, you know, your enemies. That's where I shouldn't say that. Diplomacy matters within alliances as well, but in terms of international relations, of course, the thorny question is, you know, avoiding going to war, which is the topic here. Norms are significant. And norms are the natural product of human relations. You have norms with your friends, things that you just expect, like things that you do. said you and your housemates there share meal making duties from day to day to day. I like that. You've got a rating system for the meals too, in terms, yeah, 4-part rating system. That's a norm. Right? That's a set of, like, this is the way we do things amongst ourselves. No one's enforcing that. There is no overarching international federation of gastronomy that's sort of dictating the bounds of that. It's just what we do here. It's a custom. You know? And those sorts of customs are the natural product of human sociability. Human beings get together, they talk with one another, they organize amongst themselves. And so these norms, these rules, these shared expectations spontaneously are generated by those dealings that we have with one another. And so Grotius, like Vattel argues, along with medieval and classical thinkers, that human beings are by nature political beings. We don't start off in a state of nature. We start off with our political capacity, the capacity to speak and engage in persuasive, rational speech with one another. And to the extent that we can do that, to the extent that we can talk with one another, it's quite natural, again, that an idea of justice emerges from those discussions. What's right, what's wrong, what's normal, what's not normal. These ideas are a product of our nature. They're not a way of removing ourselves from nature, as they are for Hobbes. Justice is an expression of our nature. That's the claim that Grotius and Vattel are making within this natural law tradition. And it is firmly rooted in tradition, too. You know, this implies that we have ongoing relations with one another. And so, you know, again, in terms of the sources that they use, the expectation, if you're reading Grotius, is that, and this is not a widely shared expectation presently, but it was at the time, expectation was, you've read the Bible. All of us have read the Bible, and so when Grotius refers to the Bible as a source, we're quite literally on the same page there. We have a shared tradition, shared customs, shared expectations, a kind of canon that we can refer to. We don't begin with a tabula rasa, we don't begin with a blank slate. We inherit our shared history and shared language and with all the meaning that's associated with that tradition. And so those ongoing negotiations between states, as between individuals, are afforded a respect, even in the absence of a decisive force that would ground their agreements. Those agreements between states are real. Why? Because we're by nature animals that speak. We're by nature animals that live in political communities. And that's what contributes to the substance of law. The fact that we agree upon it. The fact that we can say that sounds reasonable, that we would all do this or that we would all not do that. We don't necessarily need a sovereign state to back up those underlying assumptions. Reason can get us there. And what that does then, that understanding of natural law then, can be invoked to judge the actions taken by states. So we can say that, you know, even though the United States was technically capable of invading and occupying Iraq, it suffered no real consequences. You know, there's no UN Security Council mandate against it because, again, they have a veto on that body. So we were able to go it alone. We can still say that was an unjust war. It was both illegal and unjust, even if there wasn't a sort of arbiter that was capable of backing up international law with some force of arms. We can still know that was an unjust war. We can judge human institutions according to a higher law, which is natural law. How do we know natural law? You see some goofy kind of applications of that presently. The sort of anti-authoritarian strains that we see in Canadian and American politics presently. Some of these individuals invoke natural law to say that they are not obliged to the laws of the state, to pay for a driver's license or wear a mask or get vaccinated or what have you. That there's some higher natural law here. No, that's not how this works. The laws of the state are real, but there is a capacity to say, is that law just or unjust? It's not just the ability to back it up that makes it real. It has to, again, have some basis in reason. Tell me why. Give me a reason why. Convince me that this is a just law. So how do we know natural law? For these thinkers, we can know natural law because there's a correspondence between human reason and nature itself. Reason attunes us to the nature of things, and more to the purpose of things. Yeah.
Sorry, could you restate your last?
Yeah. So the idea here is that reason attunes us to the nature of things. So, that given the capacity to think about it and to talk about it significantly amongst ourselves, an emergent set of norms arises, and the more we get to do that, the more we get to use our reason and talk between our differences, our expectations amongst ourselves as a political community or between states will unfold in the direction of this natural law. Our laws will become more just over time, to the extent that we can have those conversations, public deliberations. So reason is a human faculty that attunes us to the order of things or the nature of things. Reason indicates what the purposes of things are. And this is, again, a way in which these thinkers cast back behind the modern tradition, back all the way to Aristotle. So the argument here, Grotius presents it quite simply at the beginning. Book on the laws of war and peace. He says, look, animals have teeth and claws and antlers or horns. Why? To defend themselves. There's a purpose that's inherent in their nature. All animals have that capacity, and human beings, well, we're a particularly frail creature. We don't have horns or sharp teeth or claws in the same way that they do, but we have hands that we can use to pick up a weapon and likewise defend ourselves. There's that kind of purposiveness inherent, and it's justified. It's completely reasonable and justified that in the same way that an animal would defend itself if it's confronted, human beings would defend themselves and would be justified in defending themselves if confronted by a mortal threat. Self-defense is reasonable and justified. They begin with that assumption. Now, you could argue that there's a kind of, has anyone studied philosophy here? In the philosophy department? No? Has anyone encountered this idea of a naturalistic fallacy? That we attribute purpose to nature? That we map these subjective ideas onto nature and see it as being inherently purposive, but it's not in and of itself purposive. It's something we attach to it. There is this danger in the natural law tradition to kind of naturalize existing social arrangements. So, for example, Aristotle says that it's natural that human beings should own slaves under certain conditions. He makes the argument that in order to have leisure, we need this underclass of slaves to provide for our perfect liberty, the liberty of a citizen. So there is that danger here. Natural law theory can be used in that way to justify just the way things happen to be. This is the way it is, That said, though, too, natural law thinking can be used as a way of criticizing the way things really are, to say that, no, that is not a natural form of human organization. it can work in either of those two directions. But the point of it is that natural law is an overarching standard accessible to human reason that ultimately should be brought forward in governing the conduct of nations. And so this is kind of an alternative to the Hobbesian conception of interstate relations, which is inherently anarchical, and where power is considered to be the fundamental reality. And it's an alternative also to Kantian universalism, based on the idea of the perfectibility of human beings, on Enlightenment rationality, and altruism and the abolition of war. So these thinkers say that war, again, is sometimes necessary, but it's only justified under certain very limited circumstances. The aim here is to limit war. Altruism. So that's the Kantian position, yeah? Is to will for yourself what you'd will for all of humankind. Will for yourself as if you weren't self-interested. So there's this, and we know this from Kant, that, the aim is perpetual peace, completely pacific relations amongst nations, the convergence of their interests and the restraints placed upon them by their own populations that will lead to the end of war altogether. Grotius and Vattel say, war may remain a necessity, but again, of very limited limited terms in terms of what would be a just cause for war. This is a middle way between national interests and universal goods, accommodating to the realities and particularities and necessities pertaining to power politics. Again, the question is not to how do we eliminate issues of power in international relations, rather how do we moderate, limit, and socialize power. So they agree, Grotius and Vattel agree, that war is sometimes necessary and is a perennial danger. And from our current experience, this seems to be the case. There's something very realistic about this assessment. We're just finding our way out of a grinding war in Afghanistan. We're seeing the sort of ongoing consequences of the war in Iraq. This idea of a perpetual peace seems pretty much an article of fantasy, considering the circumstances of global politics presently. The end of the Cold War has not meant a transition to a globe of perpetual peace. And though the U.S. won that war, the Cold War, it has not succeeded in the pacification of the world according to its own image. This is that fantasy of a new American century. American foreign policymakers after the Cold War imagined that they would enjoy this position of hegemonic status after the Cold War, and that the world would be somehow transformed in their likeness. That clearly did not occur. And we have conflicts still ongoing and certainly possible, whether in the context of civil wars within states or with the possibility of wars between great powers. China just did another flyover of Taiwan recently. They seem to be rattling their sabers there. That seems to be a potential flashpoint in terms of interstate relations. And then again, thinking back to Afghanistan and Iraq, the last 20 years has been besmirched by those conflicts. And so rather than kind of a vain hope for the abolition of war, perhaps we should try to introduce some moderation to war as it is waged. Again, what are the just causes of war? And limit war in that sense. So the question of what is a just war serves as such a moderating influence, and also can act as a check on the war for the purposes of empire building, which I think is what we saw in the war in Iraq. So to that purpose, I think it's really important that we keep in mind the justifications that were given for the American war in Iraq, as stated by Secretary of State Colin Powell to the United Nations Security Council on February 5th, 2003, and then repeated and revised in the popular media by Powell and other representatives of the Bush administration. So what were the reasons for the war? What were the justifications given for that particular conflict? It's particularly notorious episode in American foreign policy. What were the justifications given? Why was the war necessary and right for the United States and its allies to fight, according to Powell? You recall? Yeah.
By very, very thoroughly proven ties to nuclear weapons.
So Iraq had designs on acquiring nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction more generally, or WMD. Weapons of mass destruction includes nuclear weapons, along with biological weapons and chemical weapons. Now the United States did, well, but they had the receipts, is the thing. You know, they were complicit with the Iraqi regime in its earlier war with Iran. It's come out recently that even to the extent of helping the Iraqis to target Iranian forces using chemical weapons. So there's that. And we know, of course, that Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons on his own people to suppress uprisings within the country. So that's clear. But the justification given was that Iraq wants to develop weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear weapons, and it cannot be allowed to do so. And that the arms inspection regime, there was a series of UN Security Council mandates forcing Iraq to comply with an arms inspection regime carried out by the International Atomic Energy Agency, led by Hans Blix. Powell basically said that this work is too slow, that Iraq is not complying fully with these inspections. Maybe they're hiding things here or there. And so we can't wait. We cannot wait to allow them to acquire these horrible, indiscriminate weapons that they could use to threaten their neighbors, or more to the point, that would deter the United States from armed invasion. And so the world needed to act. That was the case that Powell made to the UN Security Council, that the body should give the United States a mandate to use more forceful means, beyond the no-fly zones that were imposed, well, right back through to the 1990s, after the first Gulf War, and the sanctions that were placed upon the regime. The UN Security Council should do more, and be more forceful in denying Iraq the capacity to develop these weapons. International Atomic Energy Agency. It's associated with the United Nations, but it's arm's length, an independent body. And that was the regime that went around Iraq, basically, and inspected facilities, military facilities, palaces, Saddam's palaces, research labs, looking for weapons of mass destruction. What? Energy Agency. Yeah. And you know what, though? It seems like they did a pretty good job. Their reports back were that, nope, Iraq does not have weapons of mass destruction. They may have had designs on these back in the 90s, but given the disastrous consequences of that, again, first Gulf War, when Iraq was driven out of Kuwait, they disavowed that weapons program. Probably chemical weapons, probably that, but not nuclear weapons, and no active program. So they did their work, but Powell was not pleased with that.
One of the classified documents was they revealed his speech that revealed the truth like years later.
Yeah, the presentation that he gave to the Security Council was cooked, clearly. The Nigerian uranium, the aluminum centrifuge tubes, it was all make-believe. There was no hard evidence that Iraq had this program, but there was an intent to invade Iraq. Now, you could say this is a father-son sort of question. There was some sense amongst neoconservatives that the United States should have done more when it pushed Iraq out of Kuwait, that they should have carried on to Baghdad, that the Shiite uprising in the south of the country should have been supported by American forces and the regime should have been deposed. There was a real prevalence in American foreign policy circles that the United States had just such an advantage at the time, was so much more powerful than any other rival, that they could do whatever they wanted. There's a real kind of hyperbolic assessment of what American military power was capable of. And there was kind of an ideological sense. We see this quite clearly in the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, to make replacing tyrannies with liberal democracies into a centerpiece of American foreign policy. And Iraq was kind of the first test case for that ideological mission, with the assumption being that then the habits of democracy would sort of spill out over the rest of the Middle East, making the world safe for, again, liberal democracy and free market capitalism. So there's an ideological threat, which I think was genuine, but there's also a real outsized impression of what the United States could get away with at the time. And now that's clear in hindsight, but it seems to me that the anti-war activists at the time understood much better than the neocons and the Bush administration what hard power was capable of. And so Powell makes this case. He says, I'm just quoting here from his, the case he makes to the Security Council. It says, Iraq has now placed itself in danger of the serious consequences called for in UN Resolution 1441, calling upon Iraq to open up all of its facilities to these inspections. And this body, the Security Council, places itself in danger of irrelevance if it allows Iraq to continue to defy its will without responding effectively and immediately. So Powell basically says to the UN Security Council, you're irrelevant. If you can't deal with this, you're irrelevant, and even more so, we're going to do it anyways. So that will demonstrate how irrelevant the United Nations is as a body. You know, the UN works if powerful states back it up, and to the extent that they don't, it's a debating society. You know, it needs that power and that influence to make its mandates real. So that was the original reason given, and then over time, in the public eye, that reason kind of morphed. So it began with weapons of mass destruction, then over time it became increasingly a matter of removing this murderous tyrant and liberating the Iraqi people. That became the kind of public face. Pardon me? Just oil. Yeah, it's interesting. Now, you know, if you trust someone like Donald Trump and say, well, why didn't we actually just take the oil if that were the case? There may be something to that. It's more a matter, though, keep in mind, of not having the oil for oneself, but having a hand on the tap of Iraqi oil and breaking the back of OPEC. That's I think core there. If the United States had influence over the Iraqi regime, it would undermine the significance of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Yeah. And you know, and yeah, there's a history back to the 70s actually of OPEC undermining American energy independence. So there's something to that. But in terms of, I think we should pay attention to the outward reasons as well. You know, there's just this kind of conspiratorial mindset that sometimes comes to bear here. And maybe there are conspiracies, but start with the surface. Like, what was the point of this? WMDs or a tyrant? Those were the justifications given. And so the question for us is, are those reasonable justifications for war? Was it a just war? Okay, that's the question before us here. And, you know, both of those reasons, and even the sort of argument for preemptive is given some consideration by Grotius and Vattel, and I'd like to get into, maybe not today probably, but when we meet after the break, what are the customary understandings of what constitutes a justified preemptive conflict. There are some senses in which these arguments hold water, but I would say that under close examination, neither of these are truly just causes for war. Removing a tyrant or preventing Iraq from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. Both served as pretexts, excuses, to disguise and advance American interests, the accumulation and projection of military and economic power. Okay, I'd like to, unless, are there any questions on that? Any questions on Powell's presentation there? I'm just trying to make this as simple and straightforward as possible. Here were the reasons for war, and are they just? Are they just causes for war? Is the question. And the projection of military power. You know, the idea, you know, if you look at something like the Project for a New American Century, which had many of these neocons on board as signatories, the idea was that at the end of the Cold War, rather than enjoying a kind of peace dividend, you know, harken back to the 1990s and the way that President Clinton approached the end of the Cold War. Look, we don't need to arm ourselves against the superpower, so can we dial back some of these military expenditures and put them towards more useful things? These neocons at the time that really pushed along the Bush presidency, figures like Cheney, like Wolfowitz, for example, said, no, now that we're ahead, let's get ourselves so far ahead that no one will ever hope to catch up, specifically the Chinese. That was the idea. Let's ramp up our military expenditures. And so in order to do that, we need a war. We need some reason. There was no reason. Iraq did not pose any national security threat to the United States. It had been a former client state. Outwardly, it was, you know, kind of hostile, but it was more for domestic consumption within Iraq, you know, bolstering Saddam's sort of strongman image, not seen as a toady to American interests. But Iraq posed no threat to the United States. It was a war of their choosing, a complete, not only an unjust war, but an unnecessary war of their choosing. And so I think it behooves us to ask, well, what were the reasons given? And again, do they hold water? What would constitute a justification for conflict? Okay, let's turn to Grotius here then. And this argument that war may be allowed but must be limited, that a natural law applies to all states and can be used to judge their conduct vis-a-vis one another. Now there's some practical arguments for this fostering of the sense of natural law between states. There are both immediate and long-term advantages to be gained if states behave in this sort of way. The weak can band together to protect themselves from the strong and restrain the strong using laws. And there's just the ability to carry on with your daily business. I mentioned this quote from the Prolegomena to the Law of War and Peace. Grotius writes, all things are uncertain the moment men depart from law. And so what the United States did in that particular instance, waging unjust wars, makes it difficult to make and keep the allies that are necessary in order to promote your interests. The United States burnt a lot of bridges as a consequence of that particular conflict, that war of its own choosing. The EU was infuriated by its behavior, and especially by its showing up the United Nations and the Security Council to be, again, a kind of debating society. This was really damaging to that international institution. It was really damaging to American alliances, to what we call its soft power. This is the point that Joseph Nye makes. We're reading a little later on in our syllabus. The use of hard power, do this or else, invasion is a form of hard power, compromised the United States' ability to have allies fall in line with it. Do this because it's the right thing to do. The power of the United States was arguably diminished by this particular conflict. Now, let's begin. Here's a definition from Grotius. Grotius defines first what is war. Here's how he defines it. He says, war is a, quote, condition of contending by force towards an end involving a plan and purpose. War is a condition of contending by force towards an end involving a plan and purpose. How does that definition of war differ from the definition of war that we saw in Hobbes? Yep.
For Hobbes, more so like an actual statement, anything you have distrust and fear. For this one, it is something that's set goal and end, and we acknowledge there's no other way to achieve it. You have to go to it.
Yeah.
I guess it's also, that's a limit on it, like it's sort of
Yeah.
how we describe it more, like.
Puts a limit on it. In what sense? What do you mean by that?
Well, I was gonna say like Hobbes, I don't know, like Hobbes, the way Hobbes describes war and then the way that this, like the condition, and
Towards a purpose that involves a plan. Yeah? So we're trying to accomplish something through armed conflict. There's an end to it. And I like what you said initially when you talk about a limit. That end then is not only just the purpose or what you're trying to affect, it also limits your endeavor. Say, well, what are we trying to accomplish here? How do we get there? How do we know that we have gotten there? So that the war can be over. Interestingly, and Powell's what a tragic character, because he often associated with what's called the Powell Doctrine, reflecting on his experience in the Vietnam War and arguing that any wars fought by the United States need a clear objective and an exit strategy. We shouldn't fight endless ideological wars. And here, this is what he's defending. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what I mean. Like, for Hobbes, it's like there's in Machiavelli, there's always it's almost like there's always warnings, like there's always going to be war. You're always going to have to defend or even stand. Like there's always going to be this. Like the state of nature is always going to be. They're always going to want to avoid it, and the sovereign is always going to do that.
Yeah.
And here it's trying to limit it. It's trying to say like there's got to be some, but like there has to be another reason. Like it can't just be different.
There has to be a reason for war. Why? Tell me why. What are we trying to accomplish here? Whereas for Hobbes, it's always there. That's our underlying condition, is a war of all against all. Yeah.
Because it has to happen and limit it so that people can live as individuals and just least disruptive as possible.
Yeah, and states can engage in pacific relations with one another. They can forge agreements, alliances, trade with one another. Things can get better.
So instead of war being the preemptive like Hobbes, where it's always there, war in this case is exceptional.
It is exceptional. It is exceptional. Yeah, it represents a breakdown of the interstate system if you have to advance your objectives, your national interests, using violent means. And so we try to constrain it. We try to bracket it. We try to limit it. Not to do away with war altogether. Again, there may be circumstances where it's justified. No one would think that a state invaded by its neighbor doesn't have the right to defend itself.
Even common knowledge is that you need to invade neighbor states sometimes for certain reasons.
Especially when you're dealing with illiberal states, tyrannical regimes, empires, or would-be empires. These are real threats that keep cropping up in the human experience. So we need to guard against those. But again, limit war to those very specific circumstances and justifications. So here, war is bracketed by being attached to reason at the outset, by being attached to a purpose and a plan. That said, war is under certain circumstances justified in the same way that self-defense is natural. All animals fight in self-defense. And as Grotius says, quote, man is an animal born for peace and war. And he says this is why God gave us hands to defend ourselves if need be. So I'd just like to say, maybe we'll wrap up at this point, but when we reconvene next week, I want to go through the 3 justifications that are given for war, the 3 just causes of war, which are protection, the reclamation of property, or the punishment of bad behavior. We'll go through those in turn and see to what extent the war in Iraq fits or doesn't. Make every minute it does not, is not justified by any of these particular causes. The United States was not threatened by Iraq, and that motive of defending the Iraqi people against Saddam Hussein was obviously a kind of a pretext after the fact. And I'd like to consider too under what circumstances preemptive self-defense is justified, considering Grotius's comment that, quote, no other just cause for undertaking war can there be except injury received. An idea that accords quite nicely for the justifications of armed conflict in the UN Charter as well. So we'll come back to that. If you didn't get a chance to read Grotius and Vattel, you've got a little bit more time over the reading week. I hope you enjoy it. Hope you find your way to some turkey or something like that, whatever you do in your household. There's a really cheeky turkey, wild turkey in the neighborhood who maybe. Did you?
Yeah, but it was at Governor's house.
Oh, at Govs. I've heard it's going back between Govs and the Noosu building there,
It
right?
was just kind of chilling and like trying to shred in the city bus that was driving.
Oh,
City bus.
yeah. Apparently they've been ambling about, but yeah, dangerous time for a turkey. Enjoy your reading week, and I'll have the essays back to you after that. Thanks so much. Okay. How was your foot race there?